When I'm shouting too hard, just tell me. I have this bad habit to use the full power of my voice. I'm Godefroy Chapelle. I'm coming from Belgium, and I'll speak to you of RIA, Rich Internet Application, with CSS, extjs, and more. It won't be very deep into code, because if we get into code, it will be for hours of explanation. I will try to stay more at the presentation of the various components we have used, so at least some of the glue between them. And well, let's start. So I'll come out with a few definitions so that we agree at least, or not we agree, that you know what I mean by the word I'm using. Let's say it this way. And I'll give some explanation about extjs. Who has already some knowledge of what extjs is or have, okay, and who has used it among those people? Okay. And who has done Ajax among all the people listening here? And who has done it with KSS? Okay, thank you. So I'll explain the goals we were after, the code the application we were building, so the code we produce is a reflection in the sense of reflect of those goals we were after. So first, our RIA. I'm always there to speak of the buzzwords. I like it a lot. Well, quite often buzzwords bring you to the next step, and in a lot of cases you are totally wrong. It should not have been the next step, but well, let's take the risk. So what RIA is about, vendors call it rich internet application. The main idea is to bring desktop-like application to the browser. What I mean by desktop-like application means that you have richer, or you are supposed to have richer form and widget support inside those applications. And it's less about building pages of websites than using the web to input data and access data, right? Which results often in a lot of forms. I mean, in a situation where you have lots of forms and more forms, you know that business people like to have a lot of data, so you need a lot of forms to input them. Why do I insist on this? It will come again later. It's because often it's quite expensive if you need to hand-tune all those forms, right? Alex is working by Google. I am not. I don't have 500 engineers available to build the application I'm doing for my customers, which means I cannot hand-tune each piece of JS code as Gmail does, for instance, which is obviously perfectly, perfect is not the right word, but very nice piece of rich internet application, right? And this does not have a lot of forms, for instance. It has less forms that we have to rehave, okay? So, and to make it more clear what we are building, let's go to a demo. And you'll see it's quite dry, as usual with business application. So, you're supposed to be efficient when you use it, not to look at a lot of blinking images and nice colors that are degrading and stuff like that, right? So this, to give you the context, the code I'm presenting has been done for 2 parliaments in Belgium that have asked us to use Plon and Zope to build a legislative process management system. I'm not even sure legislative makes any sense in English, so stop me if I use the wrong word. You understand? That's cool. So it's actually to support the administration that has to follow all the parliament work, which means a lot of exceptions, because politics, okay, they make rules for the others, but obviously not for themselves, right? What I mean by that is quite often the process is really complex. There's a whole lot of workflow around there, where the law project, for instance, is going back and forth between the commissions and the plenary session and stuff like that, right? And if I do silly jokes about politicians tricking us, they quite often also try to do their best, right? So, demo, as I said. So the first stuff that we need is, as quite often in data in applications, is a grid. And all people that have seen extjs already will recognize the extjs grid, which is one of the stuff that all application want, which is just like being able to sort, right? To move your columns, to decide, let me see, to decide which column you want to show or not, and stuff like that, right? So this is extjs. This is not us. We are reusing code coming out of the library, and I'll explain later how. Oops. So let's remove that. Okay. And because I have a very nice application built on a Mac system, I cannot show you batching because this application, when it runs off my Mac, I can insert one row, then Zope crashes, right? I have some trouble with Postgres and versions and so on. So, but it does batch as well, and it batches very well. Actually, it does that very, very well. I won't try to input 100 lines to show you batching and start Zope 100 times, right? I think you will appreciate me not doing it. But anyway, this component is really, really rich. Let me put, I obviously decided to hide the only column that allows me to go further, so that was wrong. This way. So let's go and see other stuff that you can do with extjs. You can, for instance, have menus. Okay, we have menus in Plone already, right? But, well, you can have menus. Then you can use KSS to change the state, right? And allow, and then get a new menu which does not have the same options exactly as we have in Plone. But I did not refresh the full page, as you have seen. It was far too quick for Zope to serve that on the same machine, right? And so I can also, let's activate it again so that I can actually update it. And then I can get to this type of nice stuff as well, where I can have modal dialogue. This has two advantages. It forces your user to do that stuff and not another. And it has another very nice side effect is that I'm actually outputting almost nothing here. I'm not computing viewlets, portlets, and all the stuff which is needed just to present 3 widgets, right, in that case. So that's also something really useful in case of RIA, because it makes it much quicker. Why is it more important for this type of application to be quicker than other one? If I'm writing an article to put on a website, it takes me maybe 1-2 days. If I'm very good, it will take me 5 minutes, but that's not the case for me. So if I need to wait 2 seconds when I'm pushing it to the website, it's acceptable because I've spent like 2 hours at least to do it. In this type of application, you have people that are doing input the whole day, and they cannot wait 3 or 5 or 10 seconds each time they want to update, right? So that makes quite a big difference between a usual Plone site, let's say, and this type of application. So, and well, we can also have nice stuff, like, as we all know, that we have already seen, which is, okay, inline validation. I'm showing this because this is, we have not coded that either. That has been coded by Jean-François Roche, who took that from Martin Aspelli, right? So this is where using all our component-based, whatever mean component in that case, code allows us to reuse someone else's code and go far quicker. This is, in this case, it's checking required, so that could have happened only server-side. Client-side, I agree. But quite often in a business application, the validation needs to happen on the server side, right? So you want to contact the server to say, is that value acceptable or not, without bringing all the logic in the JavaScript. And so let's cancel, and then let's do it again. We have internet now, right? So let's say it this way. So again, when I update, it's immediately refreshed, and I'm not reloading the full page and computing everything. So it's maybe not obvious because it goes very quickly, right? But that's what happened. So that's about it for the demo. There's the last stuff I need to specify. Is that if we look at that form or at the other one, the one that gets into the model window, you see that we have, I will say it, the widgets are aligned or put in sort of a grid, and this is not done with tables. This is done with Blueprint CSS that has been mentioned by Alex, and I'll come to that later. In other words, this is just diffs, one after the other. Again, reusing someone else's nice code, right? I cannot write all that myself, just forget it. So, now I think you have seen all the concrete stuff I wanted to speak about. Let's switch back to presentation. So for the people that have not used KSS, let me explain very quickly what it is, because I think you're more interested with extjs. So KSS is the Ajax library that is coming inside Plone 3. You are not forced to use it. Plone 3 uses it. And it tries to do what I call the layered approach. I've used other names. It's what is really important in KSS design is to separate client from server, and actually to keep all the business computed on the server and not to bring the computation on the client. For this, we have two different stuff. JavaScript is laid on the events are bound. Excuse me. The events are bound on your HTML page through CSS selectors. In other words, it's not hand-tuned page by page, right? Because it's more generic than that. That's one stuff. The second stuff is that the server is actually not sending data, but sending HTML back. It's in what we call comments, like change, replace that node of the DOM. Replace this piece of HTML by this piece of HTML. Delete that piece of HTML, right? This type of stuff. So this is not about data. It's really about HTML. So that's a very quick definition of KSS. If people are more interested, I think they went this morning to Joel's presentation. So what about extjs? So as you have all guessed, extjs is a JavaScript library. I say component-based because it's very, very object-oriented inside it, and it's more than that. They have a component factory actually inside it. So you can you have ways to instantiate a grid or a widget without needing to know the exact name of the right JavaScript class. Right? They have something smarter than that, which is based on configuration. So you would pass a type. Why is it important? Because it means that you can actually instantiate those components without writing JS explicitly. It can, and that's important for KSS because the data can come from the server, not as JavaScript, but as data, right? And in this case, this is not business data, right? It's configuration data for the presentation layer to instantiate a component, to decide this is a select box, this is a grid. That's not the same as the data that you show inside it. That's something different. So let's say more about extjs. It has a lot of components. They are quite well tuned. You have the usual controls like a date picker, like a select box, like a list where you can select among a list of stuff, and like we have the in and out widget and stuff like that. We have the grid. I insist on the grid because it's really, really for rich internet application, and I try to stop to use that silly word. It's really a demand of the customers. They are used to Excel or to something that looks like Excel, and it helps them a lot, especially because they have to go through a lot of data, right? If I can just take a side walk, this is obviously because in most cases, people don't want to invest in UI. So our users have to dig into the data the way it's presented in our models in the database, which is in most cases wrong. But because the budget are what they are, usually we have to do it this way, and they have to dig. And so the grid model, it's not that bad when they have to do that. Obviously, we could come with much better UI, but that's another question. Windows, you have seen them as well, right? And what's quite nice is that I'm using the word component again because when you instantiate a grid, you can instantiate separately the data store that the grid will be bound to. In other words, you have, I mean, for people that have worked, for instance, with Delphi like 10 years ago, it's this exact same model where you separate quite cleanly the data itself from its presentation. So it's very well engineered, in my opinion. As any piece of code, it has a lot of pitfalls, and it's getting improved, right? Why did we think extjs would make sense is in the frame of our project. The JS code is really clean. If you have written your own JS code, you know how easy it is to do ugly JS code. In this case, when you look at the library code, you find that it's really, you see immediately that there's a sense of details, that they are paying attention to make it work well. And because we are not in control and we don't have the skill to maintain that type of stuff, we want to have some feeling that we are not using something that will break apart in a few minutes, right? It has quite good documentation. It's far from perfect, but it gives you, in my opinion, a good insight enough that when you dig into the code, and that's why we are in open source, right? That you can find your way. So you are not lost, and you don't need to begin to read 1,000 lines of JS before you can use the stuff. In some cases, as usual, there are developers, so some information is missing from the doc, right? I'm a developer as well. Then there's the license issue that I want to mention because it's some sort of problem for people. They have this desire to be both a profitable business and open source friendly. So they have been going back and forth with various different licenses, which did not make it very clear for users if they were protected or not, if you could use the stuff or not, and so on. Today, the way they do it is that they make releases which are under GPL3, but you only have access to the code of the releases. So you don't have access to the code while they are to the repository or while they are doing the development. So if you want access to that code, you need to pay. So that's how they make themselves sustainable. I think it's at least a good, an interesting idea. If you want more, and if you are more a lawyer than I am, go and read the text. They've tried to make it as precise as possible what you can do under this GBL3 or not. Obviously, they don't want you to sell tools for them using their stuff, right? So there are a few exceptions to what I just said. I already said it that you can configure it quite well. When you see the grid I've shown a very basic example. Is it sortable or not? You saw I showed which columns were sortable or not. That's something that you can specify when you instantiate a grid. Is it batchable or not? And so you have, when you instantiate one of those components, you have dozens, and it's not exaggerated, parameters to configure those components, right? So you can really tune it to your need, but obviously you will need what's not in, as usual, right? I said it's stylable. I need to check the time because if not, I'll speak too much as usual. What I mean by stylable is the fact that all this is built with CSS. So those blue stuff we have seen are images. So if you don't like it, you can change it. It's not built in, and it's done with, let's clean layered approach where you can replace the stuff. It has a quite nice event system. I insist on it because it allowed us to make KSS and event and XJS collaborate quite nicely. And it means also that you can reuse it outside KSS if you don't want to use KSS, right? We have done it with KSS. Obviously, I'm one of the person interested to do it with it, but the event system is quite well done. And I had mentioned the data stores before, so I don't think I need to add anything about that. So what were the goals that we were after when we decided to use both extjs and KSS and more, as I said? We wanted it to be as usable as possible. In other words, it should be quick. You should have some sort of autocomplete stuff, and I don't want to build it myself, so obviously I did not say it. XJ comes with an autocomplete widget, right? That's the basic. We wanted it to be degradable. I mean, the customer is asking us to make it work without JavaScript. So that's one of the reasons to use KSS, to be able to make the binding of this rich UI totally separated from normal HTML, let's say, so that you could still use it slowly, but you could still use it without JS. And then last part is ease of development. As I said, we have a lot of forms, a lot of forms, and it was not a question that we could hand-tune them all. So we needed to be able to put something in place that was generic enough that at least all the forms that are not used every 5 seconds could be generated as quickly as possible. Obviously, as you all know, forms always need to be hand-tuned, but the less the better, right? Among other stuff I mentioned already, for usability, we need a good layout. We need to avoid to move the hand to the mouse to scroll to get to the last widget, which is 100 meters below ground zero. What I mean by that is that we had to find a way where if we did not want to hand-tune, we should not be writing tables and seeing how it's happening in Safari and in IE and so on. That would have been a hell. Happily, we have blueprint.css. That is a really nice framework that has been built by people outside. The main idea behind blueprint CSS, at least the idea we use, is the grid layout. So what they do is they define a virtual grid, let's say this way, and with the default stuff comes with a grid of 950 pixels wide, and they cut that into 24 columns. And with very simple CSS, you can style widgets, I'll show some code later, to be 3 columns wide, or 5 columns, have a width of 5 columns, but be displaced of 3 columns, and stuff like that. So you can, and all this without using a single table, obviously, because that would go into hell, which means that producing those forms is quite obvious as well. What I mean by ease of development, we wanted to be able to define our forms only once, even though I already said that we had 2 sorts of forms, the pure HTML forms and the model windows you have seen, right? And we have to produce those. So we needed to find a way to write them almost once, right, each form. And using Z3C form, I suppose some of you have gone to Stefan's talk, so I won't go deep into the details, but using Z3C form, because of the very fine-grained adaptability, we could really limit ourselves to rewrite what was different between the model forms and the other forms, right? I think that KSS is helping us also in this case, because of all this very generic stuff that had been already built by the Plone community. We could just port that over. As I said, Jean-François did it. So some of the code could be reused very easily, then that's done. I've mentioned Z3C form to show the forms. When we see a grid, this is the obvious mirror of a table, right? Z3C table is very similar to Z3C form regarding adaptability. You can really define columns separately from your tables, and you can reuse. So for instance, if you need to display the usual example, first name plus last name, they need to be displayed together, you will define that once. Even if you show that in 5 different tables, you can define the column itself and then fetch it later. You don't need to go into each table and then rewrite that silly function each time. So let's look at some code. this is the code that is, I mean, to make it fit on a page, because as usual it's more simple, it's more complex than that, I've extracted what I think is important to see how we render the modal window, right? So, let's do it step by step. First, we need to render the form, right? This is a Z2C form. We need to render it. So the reason I show that is to show that it's a normal Z2C form. We did not need to change it. So what you see in the modal window is actually HTML. It's nothing XJS-wise, okay, inside the modal window. Then we need to configure that window, right? That window needs to have a width, a height, which HTML it should show. And this is done by using JSON, because JSON is a very nice transport model. When you have a lot of data, as I said, you have the chance to send dozens of parameters when you instantiate one of those components. So if you were to do that in KSS, in a CSS-like format, you would not like it at all. So the way we have done it, it's over there. Maybe I have a mouse, it's maybe easier. So we use the configuration and we send the configuration first so that we can then say, please open the window with those options, right? So the configuration is sent as a dictionary, as a JSON dictionary to the client, and then the plugin, so the code that makes the glue between XJS and KSS, knows how to open the window, right? And nice stuff like this allows us to focus in the first widget, for instance, right? This can be then computed server-side depending on which form you are using, which means this type of code has nothing very specific, as you can see, which means that this modal window is written once. And we can then separately define our Z3C forms and reuse them in all the places where we need to open those modal windows, right? So it's a lot of glue code, as you can see. There's nothing very fancy that as usual with glue code, it's fancy because you need to learn all the stuff that you glue together, but there's nothing very complex in itself. And that's the second stuff I will show code-wise. Here is the definition of the layout. How did we place the various widgets besides each other, and how did we define the widths and stuff like that? This is pure blueprint stuff. Please, let's have, I said we have 24 columns, right? So we have the first widget that will take 16 columns, and it will leave 8 columns empty behind, right? It will span the 16 first columns and have 8 empty columns behind. Then the second row will also span 16 columns to make it nice and make some sense, but we'll have 2 widgets inside it, right? So it's a list of widgets inside. One that is spanning 7 and another one that is spanning 7. Does that mean? And then another one below, which is also spanning 16 stuff. So this type of, which means that we can define the layout right on the form class. And again, it will show the presentation will be exactly the same in HTML and in pure HTML and in XJS, because this is actually appending those classes to the divs. Let me show what I mean on the code itself. So you see there's a div span 7 here. If I just change it to span 12, it changed place because I have 12 plus 7, that's too much, right? It's too wide. 12 plus 7 inside 16. That's too wide, so this name widget came down, right? So it's really based on floats, and By defining this on the class itself, you can define the layout outside the HTML. Obviously, if you don't like this way, you could look up the layout. We have decided to hard code it, but you could look it up by adapting, right? So you could even decide that in certain situation you want to display it in a way or in the other. So what time is it? Okay. So all that stuff I've been mentioning has been put in various separate eggs where you can reuse some of the code. I'll make what is needed to make this presentation available. A lot of that is not purely production ready. We have delivered the first release to make it test, but obviously I'm not saying you should use that without speaking to us in production, right? I think a lot of it is very nice ideas. Some of it is more stable than other, and I won't state that now. Some stuff is simple enough that you can reuse it immediately. For instance, I think that the Z3C formula line of validation is already stable enough. Some other stuff is less. Collective extjs is mainly to package extjs as Z3 resources, so that you don't need yourself to begin to register everything inside your Plone or Zope site, right? So there's nothing very fancy there. Then this is the KSS XJS integration. So as some of you know, KSS is pluggable. It means that you can not only use what is coming back with KSS itself, but you can plug your own extension that when exactly as in this case, you need to use some external code and bind it with KSS, right? And we have two main stuff inside this: the configuration that you show, how to send configuration to XJS, which is based on JSON, and then component instantiation. How do I open a window? How do I instantiate a grid and stuff like that, right? This is needed, as I said, the grid is batching. How is the grid batching? It's using JSON format between the server and the grid itself. So we wanted a way to be able for a Z3C table to show itself as JSON. That's what we have done in Z3C table XJS. So if you have defined a Z3C table, you can use the views inside this module, and they will show up the right way for an XJS grid to understand them. This is independent of KSS. You can use that without KSS. It's just making JSON views out of Z3C table, right? Even if it's, no even. Blueprint, collective blueprint.css is actually packaging the CSS framework, and it's defining the content provider that knows how to use those layouts you have seen. So I've shown those data structure. Someone needs to know how to read them to put the right spans on the right divs. It's not a lot of code, but that's where you find it. And this is the last stuff, right? This package is actually defining widgets as content providers. Why do we need that? We need the blueprint layout engine to be able to put anything, actually. There's nothing that precludes us to put static HTML to decide how we want to lay out an HTML page with blueprint.css. So you could use blueprint.css outside what we have done, right? I mean, we have used it for forms, but you could use it for something else. And the way we have done it until now is that the layout defines other content providers that will be looked up by Blueprint when you need it. And we needed a way to express one content provider per widget in a form. That's what Z3C form content providers is doing. So it takes, if you pass it a form, it will register all named content providers so that it can collaborate nicely with blueprints.css. And I know this is highly technical, so I won't go deeper. Thanks. And I'm thinking, I have 10 minutes for question if I'm not wrong. So And then, Brian?
So we saw how the form was created and displayed.
Mm-hmm.
What's the data going back to the server look like? I mean, that's the KSS.
It's the usual KSS stuff. So it's really a normal, I mean, when I submit the form, it's normal KSS happening besides. So if you have done KSS, you have nothing special to learn in that case. The question was, what sort of data is getting out of the model window and submitted to the server? Yes?
I haven't used Blueprint, but what I've read, I thought you'd have to redo the whole site in that, using Blueprint as a CSS framework for the whole site, sort of. So have you done that, or are you able just to apply it to the widgets and components?
So the question is that do we need to change fully the site if we want to use blueprint.css? And the answer is two sides. If you want to use the grid layout, I said it defines a width, so it's not a liquid design. So that's one constraint, right? But once you accept that constraint, we have put the blueprint CSS in the end of the the CSS registry in Plone, and almost nothing broke. We had to fix very few stuff to keep the Plone look and feel. There are few stuff where I was really amazed. I thought it would be the total upside down. We could just reuse it, and it's almost transparent. So it's really impressive. I mean, that piece of CSS is really impressive. Yes?
It seems to me that the application of this inside from KSS actually is like getting around some of the speed problems on Plone. Is that a way to characterize that? Because you're getting a lot of things done that are content going into the table and the grids without reloading the whole page. And that's one of the problems that we've noticed.
I'm answering to Matt that tells me I have 4 minutes left. So the question is this KSS or Ajax or whatever RIA made to turn around the speed issues? As I mentioned it, it's part of it, but it's not only. It's also that, I mean, having a model window makes a lot of sense. There's a moment where you should focus on what you are doing and not being able to click another five links that bring you somewhere else. That's also discussable again. Depends on the user, right? But in some cases, it's also a question of the way you use the application, and you have the nice side effect that it goes quicker. But I don't think the main objective is to make it quick.
Have you tried using this with local data stores like Gears?
Nope. So I've not tried to use it with local data store like Google Gears or Gears. I don't know, Gears. I don't see why it would be a problem, except that in that case you are left alone and you need to write the JS yourself. Okay. Yes?
Have you noticed any problems between the extjs conflicting with Plone's.js? I've had some problems with the trees.
Which trees?
Tree panel in extjs.
We haven't tried a tree panel, so I cannot say. So the question is, did we have any conflict with Plone JavaScript itself? We have not tried the tree panel at least, and we have not seen stuff. But as you can see, this is not a typical Plone application, even if it's using Plone. So it means that we are also hiding some of the usual Plone stuff, which means we might not have bumped into those conflicts. But I think you should not have too many problems, because if you use XJS with the there's something important I did not mention. XJS can work with various base libraries. So you can use XJS by itself, or you can use it combined with jQuery or combined with UE, if I'm not saying something wrong. I suspect that if in Plone 3.1 you use XJS with, so I say Plone 3.1 because we were not using jQuery before for JavaScript. I suspect that if you use XJS with jQuery, you should have less trouble. But I don't know. Did you do it with 3.1 or before?
I'm using 3.1.5.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you get the problem.
You know,
Yeah.
it's easy to work around, but
Okay. I don't know.
I've noticed that.
So
Seems
I-
like Blueprint may be solving some of the problems too.
No,
At the bottom.
Well, we are not using the XJS layout engine. Some people do. We are not in this application. Other questions? Thank you.